November 4th, 1942. The desert sun hangs like a leaden weight over the charred remains of the Tel El Asa Ridge, while General Bernard Montgomery surveys the wreckage of a broken empire. For 12 agonizing days during Operation Supercharge, the British Eighth Army has hammered against the veteran steel of Erwin Rommel and his Panzer Army, Africa, until the Axis line finally snapped under the weight of 1,000-gun barrages. Winston Churchill sits in the map rooms of London waiting for the telegram that confirms the total annihilation of the German presence in North Africa, yet the victory remains dangerously incomplete. The great soul of the desert, Rommel himself, is orchestrating a retreat that defies the laws of military probability as he pulls his shattered remnants toward the west. Victory at El Alamein was supposed to be the end of the German presence in Africa, but the reality on the ground was far more complex than the headlines suggested to the cheering crowds in Piccadilly. General Bernard Montgomery stood amidst the wreckage of Operation Supercharge, watching the dust clouds of the retreating 15th and 21st Panzer divisions as they fled westward. He possessed the numerical superiority, the air cover of the Desert Air Force, and the momentum of a conqueror. Yet he hesitated at the very moment the killing blow was required. The private communications between his headquarters in Whitehall reveal a man deeply haunted by the logistical ghosts of the past. Winston Churchill expected a ruthless, lightning-fast pursuit that would swallow the remnants of the Axis forces before they could reach the safety of the Libyan border. The Eighth Army had endured 12 days of horrific attrition, hammering against the veteran steel of the German line with over 1,000 tanks and nearly 900 pieces of 25-pounder artillery. By the morning of the 4th, the Axis line finally snapped, leaving the Italian infantry divisions abandoned in the waterless wastes without transport or hope. Erwin Rommel, ever the opportunist, recognized the collapse and ordered a desperate retreat that defied his direct victory or death orders from Berlin. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability for the Desert Fox, as his forces were reduced to a mere handful of operational tanks and a catastrophic shortage of fuel. London buzzed with the frantic energy of a government sensing the end of a long nightmare. But the telegrams arriving from Montgomery's command caravan painted a different, more cautious picture. Montgomery informed the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Alan Brooke, that the administrative situation required a momentary pause to regroup his scattered armored brigades. This decision sent shockwaves through the War Office, where the strategic necessity of a total victory clashed with the tactical caution of a commander who refused to gamble his reputation. Churchill viewed the delay as a criminal waste of an opportunity, fearing that every hour granted to Rommel was an hour used to fortify the next mountain pass. The logistical paralysis that gripped the British Eighth Army was not a myth invented to excuse failure, but a cold, hard reality of desert warfare that Montgomery understood better than any politician. Every mile the tanks of the 7th Armored Division advanced required hundreds of tons of petrol, oil, and lubricants to be hauled over tracks that were little more than shifting sand. The port of Tobruk was still hundreds of miles away, and the railhead at Mersa Matruh was insufficient to sustain a high-speed chase across the desert floor. Montgomery refused to unleash his hounds until he was certain they would not starve in the middle of the wasteland, a caution born from the memory of the Gazala Gallop, where previous British successes had turned into humiliating retreats. Inside the German camp, Rommel was orchestrating a miracle of improvisation, utilizing every available vehicle to save his elite German cadres while leaving his Italian allies to face certain captivity. The German MM-35 Stahlhelm helmets of the rearguard shimmered in the heat as they prepared 88mm flak guns to cover the retreat, creating a lethal screen that the British vanguard found difficult to penetrate. Rommel knew that Montgomery was a master of the set-piece battle, but suspected his opponent lacked the predatory instinct for a chaotic, unscripted pursuit. This psychological insight allowed the Germans to maintain a thin but coherent line of retreat, even as their supply situation reached the point of total collapse. Montgomery's obsession with a flawless victory led him to ignore the desperate pleas for aggression that flowed from Whitehall in the following 48 hours. He insisted on a methodical reorganization of the 10th Armored Division, ensuring that every unit was in its proper place and every supply column was secured before moving another inch. This rigid adherence to doctrine created a vacuum of initiative at the front, where junior officers watched the dust of the retreating panzers with a sense of mounting frustration. They possessed the Sherman tanks and their 75mm Panzers, weapons capable of crushing the weakened German rearguard, yet they were tethered by orders that prioritize order over speed. The telegrams between Cairo and London grew increasingly tense as the 5th of November arrived, and the Eighth Army had yet to cut off the coastal road. Churchill reminded Montgomery that the world was watching and that a half victory would be a strategic disaster in the eyes of the Americans, who were about to land in North Africa under Operation Torch. Montgomery remained unmoved, responding with technical jargon regarding the state of his transport fleet and the exhaustion of his men. He viewed his army as a delicate machine that could easily break if pushed beyond its design limits, a philosophy that stood in stark contrast to the reckless gambles that had made Rommel a legend. On the 6th of November, nature intervened in the form of a torrential rainstorm that transformed the hard-packed desert sand into a treacherous morass of mud. The British tanks, already slowed by their commander's caution, found themselves bogged down in a landscape that favored the defender. This environmental stroke of luck provided Rommel with the precious hours he needed to clear the Fuca bottleneck and reach the relative safety of the escarpments. Montgomery used the weather as a further justification for his slow pace, informing London that the pursuit was now physically impossible until the ground dried. The failure to capture Rommel at El Alamein would haunt the Allied cause for the next 6 months, as the shattered Panzer army survived to fight again in Tunisia. The private telegrams revealed that the master of the desert was not defeated by German brilliance in the retreat, but by a British command structure that was too terrified of losing to risk the moves necessary to win absolutely. Montgomery chose the safety of the known over the chaos of the chase, allowing the most dangerous general in the Wehrmacht to slip through his fingers. Tactical nuances on the battlefield often disappear in the grand narratives of history, but the specific unit designations tell the story of a missed encirclement. The 4th Indian Division and the 50th Northumbrian Division were in positions to sweep south and trap the Axis forces, yet they were held back to facilitate the orderly movement of the armor. This prioritization of armored dominance over infantry flexibility was a hallmark of Montgomery's style, a style that won battles but often failed to finish campaigns. As the Eighth Army finally reached the Libyan border, the mood in the ranks was one of somber reflection rather than exuberant triumph. The soldiers knew they had Rommel in their grip and let him go, a realization that dampened the impact of the great victory at Alamein. The telegrams from Whitehall eventually ceased their frantic pace, replaced by the hollow praise of a victory that everyone knew was incomplete. Montgomery had secured his place in history, but he had also ensured that the war in Africa would drag on through the bloody mountain passes of the coming winter. The technical precision of Montgomery's logistics was a marvel of the age, yet it became a cage for his strategic vision. He calculated the exact number of gallons required for every mile, but he failed to calculate the cost of a war that would last another half year because of his hesitation. The Sherman tanks sat idling in the mud of the coastal road, while Rommel's trucks, running on fumes and captured British petrol, limped toward the west. History judges commanders not just by the ground they take, but by the enemies they destroy. And in this regard, the pursuit after El Alamein remains a glaring blemish on Montgomery's record. The secret cables reveal a man who was more afraid of Rommel's ghost than he was of Rommel's reality. He built a sledgehammer to kill a fly, and when the fly buzzed away, he spent 3 days polishing the hammer. The final telegram of the pursuit period arrived in London with a tone of quiet finality, stating that the enemy had escaped the immediate vicinity, and the Eighth Army was now preparing for the next phase of the campaign. Churchill read the words with a heavy heart, knowing that the chance for a decisive conclusion had vanished into the desert haze. The myth of Montgomery the Cautious was born in these frantic days of November 1942, a legacy that would follow him from the sands of Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy. The desert silence that followed the thunder of 1,200 guns was not a peace but a terrifying strategic vacuum that General Bernard Montgomery struggled to fill with his characteristic precision. As the 8th of November, 1942 approached, the transition from the set-piece slaughter of El Alamein to the fluid chaos of a desert pursuit exposed the deepest fault lines in the British command structure. The victory was undeniable in its physical wreckage as thousands of burnt-out Italian and German vehicles littered the sands, yet the strategic prize of Rommel's total capture remained a ghost dancing on the horizon. Montgomery remained ensconced in his command caravan, surrounded by maps and logistical charts, while his forward units like the 7th Armored Division begged for the freedom to strike before the German rearguard could solidify. The telegrams vibrating across the Mediterranean cables during these critical hours reveal a commander who viewed the risk of a single tactical defeat as more damaging than the failure to achieve a total strategic triumph. The logistics of the Eighth Army were a titan of British engineering, yet they became a ball and chain for a general who refused to move without a guarantee of absolute supply security. Montgomery's staff calculated that every armored division required over 500 tons of fuel and ammunition daily just to maintain a fighting posture. And as the lines of communication stretched toward the west, the number of general-purpose trucks required to bridge the gap grew exponentially. The port of Alexandria was now 300 miles behind the front, and the railhead at Mersa Matruh was a twisted wreck of sabotaged steel and craters. Montgomery informed Whitehall that he would not outrun his tail, a phrase that became his mantra and his shield against the growing impatience of the Prime Minister. Churchill, however, saw the situation through the lens of a historian who knew that great victories are often secured by the pursuit of a broken enemy, regardless of the cost to the pursuer. The technical reality of the pursuit was embodied by the Sherman tanks of the 10th Armored Division, machines that possessed the 75mm firepower to crush anything Rommel had left, but lacked the fuel to sustain a high-speed maneuver. Tank commanders sat in their turrets staring at the empty desert, waiting for the Royal Army Service Corps to deliver the jerry cans of petrol that were being prioritized for the orderly buildup of supply dumps rather than the immediate chase. This administrative friction allowed the 15th Panzer Division to regroup and establish a series of anti-tank screens that acted like a succession of tripwires for any British unit that dared to move too fast. Montgomery's refusal to decentralize his command meant that every tactical decision, even at the brigade level, had to be filtered through his personal vision of a balanced army. The intelligence provided by Ultra was a double-edged sword that Montgomery used to justify his own caution rather than to exploit Rommel's weakness. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park were delivering transcripts of Rommel's desperate pleas to Berlin, messages that described the Panzer Army Africa as a dead force that lacked even the basic transport to move its wounded. Montgomery read these reports and concluded that because the enemy was so weak, there was no need to take unnecessary risks to finish them off. He believed that the Germans would naturally collapse under the weight of his methodical advance, failing to realize that a wounded predator like Rommel would use every second of respite to sharpen his claws. The disconnect between the raw data of the enemy's collapse and Montgomery's psychological refusal to believe in that collapse created a window of escape that should never have existed. Inside the German high command, the atmosphere was one of grim determination as Rommel ignored the frantic stand-and-die orders from Adolf Hitler. The Desert Fox understood that his only hope lay in the Aguila position, a natural bottleneck nearly 500 miles to the west that offered the terrain necessary to halt a superior force. To get there, he needed time, and Montgomery was giving it to him in abundance. The German rearguard, composed of veteran units like the 19th Flak Division, utilized their 88mm guns with lethal efficiency, picking off the lead British scouts and then vanishing into the dust before a coordinated attack could be launched. This hit-and-run strategy reinforced Montgomery's belief that he was facing a coherent and dangerous opponent, further slowing his already lethargic pace. Churchill's telegrams during the second week of November 1942 reached a pitch of controlled fury that threatened to shatter the professional relationship between the civilian leader and his military commander. The Prime Minister spoke of the golden hour that was slipping away and the need for audacity and again audacity. Yet his words were met with cold technical rebuttals from the desert. Montgomery pointed to the torrential rains that had turned the coastal road into a swamp, claiming that the weather had done more to save Rommel than the German army ever could. While it was true that the mud was a significant factor, the history of the campaign shows that the British armored cars of the 11th Hussars were already finding bypasses that Montgomery refused to exploit with his heavier forces. The human cost of this caution was not immediate, but it was deferred to the bloody mountain passes of Tunisia that awaited the Allied armies in the coming spring. By failing to destroy the Panzer Army Africa in the open desert of Egypt, Montgomery ensured that his men would eventually have to fight the same veteran divisions in the far more difficult terrain of the Longstop Hill and the Medjez el Bab. The veterans of the 8th Army, the desert rats who had been fighting since 1940, felt the missed opportunity in their bones. They saw the abandoned Italian M1340 tanks and the thousands of surrendering soldiers. But they also saw the core of the German armor escaping toward the sunset, knowing that they would have to face those same crews again and again. As the middle of November 1942 arrived, the British advance settled into a predictable and slow rhythm that Rommel could anticipate with mathematical certainty. Montgomery's fixation on the set-piece battle meant that he was constantly searching for a major defensive line to attack, while Rommel was expertly avoiding any such confrontation. The general's refusal to embrace the chaos of a fluid pursuit meant that the Eighth Army was always one step behind the reality of the battlefield. The private telegrams show that Montgomery was already thinking about his place in the post-war world, carefully curating his reputation as a commander who never lost a battle, even if that meant he never quite finished the one he was currently fighting. The role of General Alexander, Montgomery's immediate superior, was one of a diplomatic mediator who lacked the will to overrule his subordinates' tactical decisions. Alexander's telegrams to Churchill were often apologetic, attempting to translate Montgomery's logistical fears into a language that the Prime Minister would accept. This layer of command insulation allowed Montgomery to operate in a vacuum of accountability during the most critical days of the pursuit. While the American forces were landing in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch, the British Eighth Army remained tethered to its supply dumps, missing the chance to create a massive pincer movement that could have ended the entire Mediterranean War by Christmas. The technical disparity between the two armies was never greater than in these weeks, as the British enjoyed total air superiority and a 3-to-1 advantage in every category of equipment. The Desert Air Force flew hundreds of sorties a day, strafing the retreating German columns until the coastal road was a graveyard of vehicles. Yet without a ground force to block the path, the German personnel simply transferred to whatever trucks remained and continued their westward flight. Montgomery's refusal to drop paratroopers or land small coastal forces behind the German lines, tactics he dismissed as unbalanced, remains one of the great tactical mysteries of the African campaign. He was a man of the earth in the heavy artillery, unable to grasp the potential of vertical or amphibious envelopment in the heat of a chase. The psychological impact on the German leadership was one of profound relief as they realized the Iron Monty was not going to risk a headlong rush. Rommel wrote to his wife that the British were excessively cautious, a sentiment that was echoed by the OKW in Berlin. The German generals were baffled by the lack of a British attempt to cut the road at Halfaya Pass or Solum, two locations where the geography favored a blocking force. Montgomery's focus remained on the balance of his divisions, ensuring that each brigade had its full complement of water and ammunition before allowing them to ascend the steep escarpments that led into Libya. By the time the Eighth Army reached the Aguila position in December, the pursuit had officially failed in its primary objective of destroying the enemy. Rommel had established a formidable defense in the salt marshes and dunes, a position that would take another major set-piece attack and another month of preparation to break. The opportunity of November 1942 was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a prolonged campaign. The telegrams from this later period show a Montgomery who was defensive and prickly, lashing out at any suggestion that he had been too slow. He had won the Battle of El Alamein, but he had lost the Battle of the Pursuit, a distinction that many historians would overlook in the glow of the final victory. The legacy of these frantic communications serves as a masterclass in the tension between military administration and strategic intuition. Montgomery was the supreme administrator, a man who could organize 1 million men and ensure they were fed and armed, but he lacked the coup d'oeil of a Napoleon or a Patton. He saw the desert as a giant warehouse to be managed rather than a battlefield to be dominated through speed and aggression. This administrative mindset saved many British lives in the short term, but it cost thousands more in the long run by allowing the Wehrmacht to survive and fight in Italy, France, and Germany. As we examine the original documents and the decrypted signals today, the image of Montgomery that emerges is one of a complex and deeply insecure leader who used logistics as a psychological barricade. He was terrified of a reverse that would tarnish his newfound status as the savior of Britain, and this fear manifested as a paralyzing need for absolute certainty. And those who wait for the perfect moment often find that the moment has already passed them by. The private telegrams between Montgomery and Whitehall remain the most damning evidence of a victory that was allowed to wither on the vine. The sun finally set on the African campaign in May 1943, but the seeds of that long delay were sown in the mud and the telegrams of the previous November. The Eighth Army had marched across half a continent, But the ghost of Rommel's escape at El Alamein would always linger in the dust of their tracks. It remains a story of a great man who was not quite great enough to embrace the chaos of total victory, choosing instead the quiet safety of a logistical plan. Given the immense pressure from Churchill and the intelligence from Ultra, do you believe Montgomery's slow and steady approach was a brilliant safeguard against disaster? Or did it needlessly prolong the war in North Africa? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.